we will spend the next few minutes introducing some very basic concepts as a brief introduction to the study of ecology. When we think about ecology, we can think about discussing the interactions between organisms and their surrounding environment. Some of the environment might include abiotic factors or non-living factors, but it might include living factors as well, such as how organisms interact with other organisms. There are various levels of study within ecology, and the next few chapters that we'll discuss kind of follow the same hierarchical scale. So we can talk about organismal ecology, population-level ecology, or groups of organisms of the same species. We can also talk about communities, or groups of organisms of different species that interact with each other, and we can even think about ecology at a more global scale, namely at the ecosystem level. So these will be the focus of the next few chapters. Let's begin with a very brief overview of Earth's major biomes. When we talk about biomes, we're talking about large-scale geographical areas that tend to be dominated by very specific types of vegetation as well as other organisms. When you think about things like the desert or the tundra or the grasslands like here in North Dakota, it turns out there are two factors that really largely determine where these various biomes are found. Those factors tend to be how much precipitation a region receives on a yearly basis, as well as their average annual temperature. So it's precipitation and temperature that, again, in large part determines where we find these large biomes. So let's just briefly discuss some of the major biomes, the terrestrial biomes found on Earth. So, for example, we think about rainforests, warm, lush regions, lots of growth. This is, of course, where we find most species throughout the world. And it turns out, of course, if you think about tropical rainforests, they, of course, receive lots of rain on a yearly basis, and their temperatures tend to be, well, fairly stable, fairly warm throughout the year. In contrast, we can talk about deserts, the other extreme. Hardly any precipitation on a yearly basis, and, well, it depends on the desert that you're referring to, but temperatures are often quite warm, and there can be some, of course, some fluctuation at different parts of the year. But as you can imagine, organisms that live in a desert, of course, have adaptations that allow them to live in these very harsh, low moisture environments. Grasslands, temperate grasslands, like we have here in Grand Forks, North Dakota. What we have here is a situation where we receive moderate rainfall throughout the year, but not enough really to support the growth of lots and lots of trees. So as a result, we have lots of grasses and small shrubby plants that tend to grow out on the prairie. Other parts of the United States and other parts of the world as well, dominated by temperate forests. So these are regions where there are lots of hardwood trees and maybe some conifers as well, but of course adequate rainfall to support the growth of these large plants throughout the year. Boreal forest, often referred to as taiga, these are regions dominated by conifers. They tend to be found a little farther north, up into Canada, and these are regions that can spend lots of the time throughout the year well below freezing, but again receive enough rainfall to support growth of these large trees. The tundra, this is even farther north. This is regions dominated by permafrost, so where the soil can essentially be frozen year-round. There tend not to be any trees growing up in these regions. Again, there's just not enough moisture availability in the soil to support the growth of those large plants. But there are many smaller plants that can grow, and even lichens, like we see here. A caribou will often eat lichens, which we call are fungi and algae growing symbiotically together. Let's now shift gears a bit and talk about aquatic environments. And we won't say much about oceans or streams, but I just want to mention a few comments about lakes. So lakes, if you think about lakes that are found in temperate regions that experience seasons, in Minnesota, for example, there are some dynamics that occur on a yearly basis within temperate lakes. So the basic question is, how do seasons affect lakes? And so let's briefly discuss the concepts of lake stratification and turnover. What you should realize at the outset is that water is most dense, it's heaviest, at a temperature of 4 degrees Celsius. So keep that in mind. That's sort of crucial to this whole process. So think about a lake in the wintertime. The upper layer is frozen, and so water that is slightly warmer than that tends to be, of course, found below that. And again, water is most dense at 4 degrees Celsius, so water at that temperature will be found toward the very bottom of the lake. Now, as the winter progresses, things sort of stabilize, they settle out. We say lakes become stratified. So that just simply means we find these layers. High oxygen near the surface. We can also talk about layering of temperature as well. And we tend to find lots of nutrients settling toward the bottom of the lake. But as spring hits, that surface water warms up. So it starts to approach 4 degrees Celsius. As it does so, of course, it becomes heavier, becomes denser. That tends to allow it to sink down toward the bottom. That effectively churns the water in the lake. So here we have an example of a spring turnover. So we get a mixing or a churning of the nutrients and the oxygen. As summer settles in, again, things start to stabilize. They become stratified. Of course, we find the warmer temperature toward the surface, the cooler temperature water down toward the bottom. But then as fall hits, again, think about the surface water. Now it's cooling. Again, it's approaching 4 degrees Celsius. As it approaches that temperature, it becomes more dense, once again causing things to mix and churn, thereby creating a fall turnover. So it's these seasonal dynamics, these turnovers, these stratifications, that are a very, very common part of lakes throughout temperate regions. Let's now talk about more global, large-scale phenomena. Namely, let's begin with our discussion of seasons. So why is it that we experience seasons? First of all, you have to realize it really has nothing to do with how close Earth is to the sun. That's a very common misconception. In fact, Earth is closest to the sun in December and January, and farthest away from the sun in our summertime, namely in June or July. So it's not that at all that determines seasons, which makes sense because, of course, when it's our summertime, it's the southern hemisphere's wintertime, right? So it's not that at all, but in fact, it's just simply this Earth's tilted axis of rotation relative to its pathway around the sun that essentially is responsible for seasons. So, for example, if you think about when it's our wintertime, let's think about December on the far right here. Northern hemisphere, of course, is still receiving sun. We still see sunlight in the wintertime. But notice that the northern hemisphere is tilted slightly away from the incoming rays of sun. So those light rays, they still strike the northern hemisphere, but they do so at a slightly oblique angle. So sunlight is hitting Earth. Those light rays are sort of spread out over a larger area relative to the situation in our summertime. Sunlight is more directly overhead. Thereby, in the wintertime, the sun rays are spread out, and it simply doesn't warm up Earth's surface nearly as much as it does in our summertime. So, again, it's simply the Earth's tilted axis of rotation that is responsible for seasons. What about these large-scale distinct weather conditions? For example, in the tropics, they tend to be very hot and rainy. Well, if you think about this, the equator tends to be receiving the most intense sunlight on a yearly basis, so lots of evaporation taking place. And if you think about near the equator, that's mostly ocean, so lots of water there. So the water is evaporating from the tropical regions. As that warm air, that warm moist air, as it rises, of course it becomes cooler and cooler as you go to higher and higher altitudes. Cooler air holds less water than warm air. So at some point, the warm air rises so far that water condenses, and of course it rains. So tropical regions, again, tend to be dominated by lots and lots of moisture, lots and lots of rain on a yearly basis. Think about that same basic concept and think about mountain ranges. Here we're illustrating the so-called rain shadow effect. So imagine an ocean toward the far left here wind sweeping across that ocean, picking up lots of moisture. But if it then hits a mountain range, that moist air will be pushed up to higher altitudes. Again, it becomes cooler at higher altitudes. That cool air holds less moisture than warm air. So you see, there tends to be lots of rain on this side of the mountain. But then as that air passes over the mountain, not only has it lost most of its moisture to begin with, but also as it goes to lower and lower altitudes, it becomes warmer and warmer. And of course, warm air can hold more moisture than cool air. So you tend to have very dry, desert-like conditions on this side of the mountain. Again, this is illustrating the so-called rain shadow effect. So what we've done is just briefly introduce some very basic concepts. This serves as a brief introduction to the next few chapters, which again will focus on population, community, and ecosystem level ecology.